Okay, colleagues, welcome back. Today we have a very special class. Indeed, every class is special in a course like this, but today more so than usual. Today we are discussing the singular, the enigmatic, the protean, the one and only Socrates. Throughout the ages, philosophers have tried to construct radically divergent pictures of who Socrates were and what he stood for. Therefore, I want to stress that in this lecture, as well as in every other, I am first and foremost giving you my own perspective. I am trying to bring out, to focus, the issues that animate and inspire my own thinking. So I am deliberately choosing to be selective, oftentimes advancing a controversial or even a minority position. I do so because I believe that it is the task of philosophy to first and foremost move us to think. Therefore, as a matter of conscious choice, I would rather be provocative than boring. So I would encourage my students to keep this in mind at all times. And I think it's doubly appropriate for me to talk about this issue of perspectivism, for the lack of a better word, but also this perpetually open-ended and essentially dialogical nature of philosophy, and to do so in a class on Socrates, because basically this is exactly how I am going to interpret Socrates' main message, that to do philosophy is to first and foremost dare to think for oneself, which brings out this essentially subversive element of Socrates' philosophy, which he seems to share with the sophists. The idea that we cannot take for granted the values, the norms, and the customs of our society in an uncritical fashion. A potentially religiously blasphemous and politically treacherous doctrine, precisely for which, quite possibly, Socrates was executed by the city of Athens, his native polis, which should serve, I think, as an important reminder of the inherent danger of philosophy. Many people embarking on the philosophical enterprise hope, in a fairly naive way, I think, to merely find a substantiation of the ideas, ideals, and values that they already hold. Such overly optimistic attitude, I'm afraid, is deeply antithetical to the spirit of philosophy, properly understood. If we are willing to be guided by the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument, as Rick Roderick puts it, then we have to be open to the possibility, indeed to the danger, that the better argument might lead us into the dark and the dangerous places. Nietzsche ominously warns us that there may indeed be truths too terrible for us to bear. But such danger is inevitably the price for thinking for oneself. Though let me note that there are dangers of not thinking for oneself as well. Dangers on both sides, right? Such is the nature of human predicament. But back to Socrates. We know about Socrates from the accounts of others, first and foremost Plato. Socrates himself chose to write nothing, instead preferring to engage in a live, face-to-face discussion. And I think we can discern two separate reasons, and this preference for the dialogue form, which will, to an extent, carry over into Plato's philosophy. This commitment to the dialogue form could and probably should be taken as an expression of a fundamental methodological principle, a principled commitment to the free and open discussion of the issues of overriding importance, ultimately dealing with the proverbial philosophical question: what is the meaning of human life? What constitutes proper human excellence, arete? Or, to put it simply, what should one do? How should one live? What values and principles should guide one's behavior? Now, this picture of Socrates as a man who paradigmatically thought for himself and who was prepared to overthrow long-cherished conclusions if he found out that they could not be sustained by rational scrutiny, and taught others to do the same. As Miles Burney puts it, this picture has become, I think rightfully so, synonymous with philosophy itself. synonymous with philosophy as a way of life. So let me elaborate a bit further on both the presuppositions and the ramifications of such a view. In Plato's Apology, Socrates famously proclaims that he knows nothing. Far from a mere profession of ignorance, this statement reflects an important piece of genuine knowledge, the realization of the limits of human intellect. It may be, perhaps, that gods, if they exist, have genuine knowledge of the world. But among men, he is wise who, like Socrates, understands that ultimately he knows nothing. Clearly, Socrates also believes that it is worthwhile for us to seek after knowledge. However, any conclusions that we reach in this quest can only be taken as tentative, preliminary, hypothetical, always potentially open to amendment and revision. And yet, Socrates has an intuition, which I think at the end of the day has to be right. The intuition that this quest can only be pursued in conjunction with other human beings. After all, there is something essentially and fundamentally public about the very language which is indispensable for both individual thought and public discussion. In fact, the former, individual thought, seems to be ultimately contingent upon the latter. Before we can think for ourselves, society has to teach us to think at all. And so in Socrates, we also find a hope, really a hope rather than an established conclusion, I think. A hope that by engaging in a dialogue with others, although we can never really reach the truth with a capital T, or at least know for sure or guarantee that we have reached one, we can at least move closer to it. Or to put it differently, in Socrates we see a commitment to the dialogical and public, and therefore to potentially cumulative and progressive conception of human reason. Again, this emphasis on the dialogical nature of philosophy, from Socrates to John Stuart Mill, to Hans-Georg Gadamer and to Jürgen Habermas in our own day. This commitment to dialogue, I think, underlies what is essentially the most valuable about the Western philosophical tradition. And yet, I think we should also remember that there are definite social conditions that allow one to engage in philosophy, both then as well as now. On the one hand, one needs the leisure and often the education in order to engage in these kinds of abstract, detached speculation. One is reminded of Marx's famous dictum that the dominant, the ruling ideas of every age tend to be the ideas of the ruling class. At least for the simple reason that it is the rulers who have time to think, not to mention the power to preserve and to propagate their ideas. Is it a coincidence, then, that though Socrates, allegedly, was happy to engage in a discussion with any man, Plato mostly portrays Socrates conversing with members of the aristocracy or of the merchant class? Social history of ideas, I think important to keep in mind, and much as I personally admire the core of Socratic philosophy, there may indeed be some of his doctrines that we may want to, so to speak, pay a closer attention to on the account of Socrates' aristocratic connection, so to speak. Not to mention Plato's aristocratic pedigree. Plato, who after all is our primary source for the ideas of Socrates. Now, I was talking about the social conditions of philosophy. Now, one is leisure. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that the vast majority of people alive on planet Earth today, in all likelihood, do not have the access to this rare and luxurious commodity of having leisure time at their disposal. Let me make a silent nod to Marx, with his insistence on the primacy of objective material, if you want, economic conditions, primacy vis-à-vis the political organization of any given society. But there is also a second condition of philosophy, it seems, the condition that has to do with the suspension of the normal course of events, the breaking down of the familiar facade, of the taken for granted assumptions and presuppositions of daily life, such as was brought about by the time of Socrates, by the growth and the development of the ancient polis, as well as by the chaos and the horror of the Peloponnesian War, to speak in terms of events of a more immediate nature. This brings us back to the distinction between nomos and physis, which we already touched upon in the previous classes. I remind you of how William Guthrie invites us to imagine how in a simpler community, the inclination of individual interest appears to be very closely aligned with the demands of public duty or the norms of justice. But as the simpler communities gradually get transformed into a more complex shape, which is the ancient polis, and as the polis itself gets shaken to the very foundations by foreign enemies without and factional strife within, so the cracks begin to appear. Is justice really a virtue, or merely a high-minded simplicity, a disguise for the interest of the stronger? In a simpler time, one does not really ask for a definition of justice, or courage, or patriotism. Their meanings are just so obvious. Just open the dictionary. But by the time Socrates comes on the stage, by the time he enters the agora, the meanings of these words are no longer obvious. And Socrates, despite his claim that he knows nothing, will in fact propose his own definitions. Indeed, we see how even in the Apology, he advances a number of positions, that the greatest good in life is to take care of one's soul, that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, that no one does wrong willingly, that the proper human excellence is one, and that it comes from knowledge and leads to happiness, that injustice harms the doer, and that it is better to suffer injustice than to perpetrate it. All vice comes from ignorance, and indeed that to a good man no harm can come either in this life or the next. Although Socrates in the Apology is expressly agnostic as to whether death leads to a complete annihilation, akin to a dreamless sleep, or whether in death the immortal soul carries on its activity, though in a different form. We shall discuss these views, as well as their later potential development by Plato. We shall do so in due course in the coming classes. But today I want to leave us with the primacy of the open-ended dialogue, with the primacy of skeptical inquiry, of daring to ask the biggest and the most important questions. Indeed, it may very well be, as Rick Roderick I think very aptly put it, that one may be a fallibilist. That is to say, one may hold beliefs, sometimes with great conviction and passion. But about those convictions, one may hold a further belief, that these convictions may very well turn out to be false in the final analysis. This is how I want to propose we treat the apparent positive doctrines of Socrates. It may very well be that Socrates held those doctrines with great passion and great conviction, on the grounds that, so far, this is where the force of the better argument has taken him, and held them with such passion that he was even prepared to die for them. And yet, it may very well be that up until the very end, Socrates was perpetually open to the possibility of being convinced otherwise. Indeed, exactly as Plato portrays him in the dialogues Crito and Phaedo, the dialogues that lead up to Socrates' eventual death. I leave you on this solemn note. May this serve as a reminder and a testimony to the ultimate stakes of the philosophical enterprise. Next time we shall take up the arguments of Socrates and of Plato. And until then, Take care.